Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor. And today we're going to be talking about Stephen King, specifically Stephen King in the 1970s. The 1970s, Stephen King's debut year, when his first books appeared on the scene. Stephen King. So a few months ago, I did a video where I gave myself a challenge where I would read every book by an author. And I let my viewers decide in the comments, hey, which author should I read every book by? I took all the names suggested, put it on a wheel, spun the wheel, and I got Stephen King, much to my shock and dismay. Dismay because I have had a mixed experience with Stephen King, had mixed feelings about him. His books seem all over the place as far as quality is concerned. And he wrote a lot of books. He's still writing books. So I knew when Stephen King won that I had a big commitment to read all of these books. And so last year, I read every book from the 70s. I don't know that I'm going to be reading every book from the 80s this year, but I'm going to get as many of them in as I can. The 80s were a big decade for him. So last year, I read all the books from the 70s. And it was a fun experience. I had a good time actually with Stephen King in the 70s. Looking back, it might be his strongest decade as far as literary quality is concerned. We'll see. We'll see. He released 6 books under his own name. At the same time, he was releasing some other books, I believe, either in the 70s or I think in the 70s under Bachman, Richard Bachman. Was a pen name that he was releasing some books by. But I'm not going to be getting to those books until the 80s when he released them under his own name. So in the 70s, under his own name, he released 6 books. The first book that he released was Carrie, which was released on April 5th, 1974. Initially, Carrie sold okay in hardback. I'm showing the first edition covers up here using my magical powers. So this is the first edition cover for Carrie. I like this cover. It's very 70s. It's a very 1970s cover, and I like it. I like it a lot. It's one of my favorite covers from the 70s, actually. And it sold okay in hardback. It sold better in paperback. It sold fairly well in paperback, actually. But when the movie came out, that is when Carrie started selling like crazy. That's when it became a bestseller, is when the film came out. Because the film was fantastic. And if you see the film, you never forget the film. And the story of the film is close enough to the book that you pretty much know the plot of the book if you've seen the movie. But the book has some interesting differences. Carrie's a bit different than she is in the film. All the characters are a little bit rougher in the book. This is the first instance of a crazy mom in Stephen King. Started right out of the gate with a crazy mom. Crazy mom makes her appearance in many Stephen King books. But this is the first crazy mom, and she was a doozy, man. Poor Carrie. Carrie has telekinesis. She has the power to move things with her mind. And she's picked on, she's bullied because she's different. Her mom is a crazy religious person. I mean, crazy. And so she has to deal with that, and she doesn't know much about life because she's been sheltered by crazy mom. And eventually she gets her revenge using her superpowers. It's an excellent book. I was surprised how good it was. It's a short book. Really short, really tightly plotted, really to the point. And it's a really good book. The villains were cardboard cutouts. There's a couple villains in this novel that are just so awful they should just have V's tattooed on their heads, because they're so villainous. Which seems to be a Stephen King thing where he'll have some one-dimensional villains. Definitely so in this book, but it doesn't really matter too much because the other characters in this book were interesting enough. and the plot was great. And you really feel for Carrie. It's kind of a tragedy, this story, as well as being a horror novel. Excellent. I liked it a lot. Great debut, like I said. So Stephen King was doing well out of the gate. But the second novel that he came out with was Salem's Lot. Not too crazy about this cover of Salem's Lot, the first edition cover. It's not exactly... I mean, this is a book about terrifying vampires. The paperbacks did a much better job on the covers than on the first edition, but, you know, what do you do? A non-scary Salem's Lot cover. This novel was released on October 17th, 1975. And it did well, this novel. It was not a bestseller in hardback, but it did well. Again, the popularity of this increased in 1979 when the miniseries came out on television, which was really good, actually. It was, if you haven't seen that miniseries, it's cheesy. It's got some cheesy moments, but it's also really entertaining, and it's pretty much a good horror movie. A good long horror movie, and it's made for television. But it's good. It's of high quality. Excuse my mailman. Bringing mail to the Vaughn Manor whilst I'm making a video. What do you do? So anyway, where was I? Oh yes. This novel, this vampire novel, basically has the premise of what would happen if Dracula came to America in the modern day and went to a small town. Modern day being the 1970s. So basically it's a story about a vampire who's an awful lot like Dracula and his evil human-ish companion come to America and start infecting the town and turning people into vampires, causing all kinds of trouble. And a small group of people who try to stop the vampire. A little group of vampire hunters like you had in Dracula. And it works really well. It's an excellent book. It's not Stephen King's best book. It's not Stephen King's best book from the 70s even. It is my favorite Stephen King book from the 70s. There's something about this book that just really works. The depiction of Salem's Lot itself, the decay of this small town, and it being infected by vampires, and it's just, the atmosphere was great, the plot was really strong. The characters were good enough, you know, they were decent, nothing spectacular. But it was decent, the characters were decent. It was just a good, solid horror novel. And it was good enough that it was nominated for the World Fantasy Award back in '76. And this is before Stephen King was a really big deal, so that's impressive. It was really good. I think this book probably took some people by surprise back in '75 and '76, just by the quality of it and the scope of it and the vision of it. It was unusual for the time, and it was an excellent book. So yeah, Salem's Lot. I liked that one a lot. He followed that up with The Shining, which was released on January 28th, 1977. This was Stephen King's first hardback bestseller. So he was doing well at this point with The Shining. His first hardback bestseller. The cover on this one I like, particularly the little animals in the corner of the cover there. I like this cover. This is just a very 1970s cover, and it's very much of its time. It's just, I like it. I like this cover. And it's an excellent novel about the Torrances, a doomed family with Father of the Year, Jack Torrance, going slowly insane, being driven insane by a hotel. He has taken a job as a caretaker for a hotel in Colorado over the winter. He brings his wife and child to this hotel, which happens to be haunted, and he has his own demons that he's bringing with him because he's an alcoholic. What can go wrong, right? Everything can go wrong. You've probably seen the movie. Everybody's seen the movie, it seems like. Excellent film. Some pretty big differences between the movie and the book. The movie is great, and the movie works really great, but Jack Nicholson in the film is crazy from the start. I mean, he's just driving up to the hotel, and you're like, don't go to the hotel with this guy. This guy is, don't go there. In the book, Jack is a much more sympathetic character, and he's not a complete nutcase before he gets to the hotel. The hotel, the evil of the hotel, because the hotel is either haunted or it's an evil entity or there's both going on. And the hotel corrupts Jack and works on his weaknesses to turn him into, a dangerous lunatic whom his family is stuck with up there in this hotel, snowed in Colorado. This book is probably his best book from the 70s. I think it's probably better than Salem's Lot. I liked Salem's Lot better, but this book is probably a better book. Certainly, these are the best characters that he's come up with out of the 3 novels. These are the most complex characters. Stephen King had a problem with alcohol himself, so he put a lot into the character of Jack, I think. He knew what he was talking about when it came to that. And it works really well. It falls apart a little bit at the end, but just a little bit. It goes a little over the top at the end, but that's okay. That's all right. It doesn't hurt anything. It's an excellent book. So again, another strong book. 3 good books in a row here in the 70s. Now, after this, he started writing a big old long book called The Stand. But at this point, he's a big hit, Stephen King, so they needed to put out another book. So they put out Night Shift, which was a collection of his stories. This was released in February of 1978, hard on the heels of The Shining and its success. Now, this had a bunch of his short stories in this book, many of which were published in such high-class magazines as Penthouse and Cavalier. High-class stuff. But the stories were of very high quality. This is an excellent book. Just as a book, I think it could be the strongest book that he put out in the 70s. It could be the best book that he did from the 70s. Just because the quality of the stories is so high. These are all horror and suspense stories for the most part. They show a lot of imagination. A lot of the stories are very reminiscent of Richard Matheson's short stories, who was a big influence on Stephen King. You can totally see it in this book. It's just an excellent collection of stories. There were only a couple in here that weren't really, really good. And even they weren't bad. There's not a bad story in the bunch here. They're all excellent in their own ways. You have a kind of a prequel to Salem's Lot with Jerusalem's Lot in here. Although that is a very different story. There's just a lot of cool stuff in this book. Excellent short story collection. Excellent. So it was another great book. And so that came out to kind of fill that space in while he was writing The Stand. Now, The Stand was his epic novel, and The Stand was released October 3rd, 1978, it was basically an epic fantasy novel, The Stand was. I guess he got the idea that he wanted to do a Lord of the Rings kind of thing, but in modern America. And so I think everybody pretty much knows the plot of The Stand as well. A very popular novel, The Stand. Although, if you've seen my review of The Stand, I cut loose on this book because I think it's his least successful book from this decade. I won't say that it's one of his least successful books because he had plenty of other stinkers coming along in the future, from what I remember. But I don't think it works, The Stand, overall. It's just too much of a mixed bag. It's a really mixed bag, The Stand. A lot of good stuff in here, a lot of bad stuff. Some great characters, some bad characters. And I've thought about this book more since I did the review. There's two things that really hurt this book. One, it doesn't have much of a plot. It just doesn't. Huge disease, pandemic wipes out most of the population, and whoever's left either joins the good group or the bad group. And the bad group is in Las Vegas, and eventually there's going to be a confrontation between these two, which never really happens. And it's just, the plot is just weak. It's just a weak plot where this big stand that's in the title never really happens, actually. I don't think. And another weakness is just the main villain, Randall Flagg. I'm reading, at the moment that I'm filming this, I'm almost finished reading The Fellowship of the Ring. And I couldn't help thinking about Sauron, the evil villain from Lord of the Rings, who's always shadowy and you just hear about him. And he just seems really dangerous and creepy because you don't know much about him. He's this creepy, evil being who just radiates menace. And Flagg is kind of the opposite. He's totally in your face, and the more you know about Flagg, the less scary he becomes. He just becomes kind of annoying and pathetic and sort of like a second-string Batman villain almost towards the end. He's just nothing special. In my opinion, there's just not much scary about this guy for the most part. There are a couple scary moments regarding him, I guess, in the book, but nothing really. And so there's some of his best stuff in this book and some of his worst stuff. And it's just hugely long. I read the version that came out in the 90s, which is even longer, where he put back in a bunch of stuff he had cut out originally, and he updated some cultural references, which are, of course, out of date now. It's just, it didn't work for me, and I don't think it's all that great a book, but it is extremely popular. And it was extremely popular at the time. It, again, was nominated for a World Fantasy Award. Stephen King was doing good with his nominations for those. And it was very popular. People liked it. And I can see why. It's a readable book. It's a very readable, entertaining book, if you're just not that, demanding, I guess. So The Stand was the first book I read out of those books. So this was the fifth book I read. And it was the first one I'm like, ugh. A lot of excessive, extraneous stuff that wasn't necessary and wasn't good. There was some that worked. But a lot of it just didn't work at all. And it was the first kind of instance where you see Stephen King feeling like he could just write whatever and just put it in his book, and he figured it's fine. Hey, if I come up with it in my head, I'll throw it in the book and fine. No matter how ridiculous or absurd, he just put it in there. He put everything in there. Everything. Too much. So he followed up The Stand with The Dead Zone, which was released on August 30th, 1979. Now, because The Stand was popular and his other books were really good, this was actually a bestseller. This was the first of his, I think it was his first New York Times bestseller, I believe. And it was among the 10 best-selling novels of the year. So this did the best out of the gate, The Night Shift. The Dead Zone. The Dead Zone is what I'm talking about. The Dead Zone did the best out of the gate. And it was a really strong book. It was tightly plotted. It was an excellent story. It's an engaging story. It was about something. The main character was very sympathetic. And it was just a really good quality book, which was very different than the book that came out before it. So Stephen King, he does have range in his imagination. At least he did at this point. He told different kinds of stories in the 1970s. They weren't all the same thing. They were all different, which was cool, I think, at the time. You never really knew what this guy was going to put out next. He had, like I said, a depth of imagination. He has a very readable prose style. And this book was very popular too. I don't think it was as popular as the other ones were. At least it doesn't seem to have held up with The Shining or The Stand or those other ones as far as popularity is concerned. Quality-wise, it's an excellent book. It might be the best book as far as the quality of the plot. It was certainly really, really good. I think it was up there quality-wise with The Shining. So a really strong end to the 1970s with The Dead Zone. So he had, in my opinion, 5 really good books in the 70s, and one book that was just Unfortunately, the one that was the one that was like gigantic. But you have to admire him for even doing that book, for even writing that book, for taking that chance, which paid off for him, obviously. It was ambitious. And you have to admire him for following through on that ambition. Even if I don't particularly care for the results, plenty of other people do. And it was a good, strong decade for him, the 1970s. And by the end of the 1970s, Stephen King was really kind of getting huge. And in the 80s, he was huge. In the 80s, which is the decade I'm going to be reading next, I'm going to be reading Firestarter real soon, probably within the next day or two. I'm going to start that book. And I don't know that Stephen King has ever been bigger than he was in the 1980s. He produced a lot in the 1980s. I kind of get the feeling that overall, it's kind of been downhill from there. Although, as far as his work is concerned, I know he wrote a lot of good books after that period. So I'll have to see as I read along what my opinion of those books are. I'm going to try to go into these books with as fresh eyes as I can have. I've noticed a lot of these books that I've read in the 70s, I read when I was younger. I think I read all of these books when I was younger. In some cases, very young. And so the experience was completely different reading them now as a senior citizen. And so it was an interesting reading experience. I'm actually glad now that I got Stephen King because I've gotten a lot more out of his books than I expected to. Even The Stand, which I didn't particularly care for, had some really strong moments in the book. There were some character moments that were just really strong. It was just, in a mess. So what do you do? But it'll be interesting to see what's coming. I've heard a lot of great things about the books in the 80s. Again, some of these I've read in the 80s. And some of these books I haven't read before coming up in the 80s. Although I think I've probably read most of them when I was younger. So we'll see. We'll see what my opinion is. I remember Firestarter just being okay. I remember Cujo just being okay. But a lot of other people really like those books. So we'll see. That's Stephen King in the 70s. I'll shut up now. I've talked for long enough about Stephen King in the 70s. Strong decade. We'll see how the 80s are. Okay, guys. I will catch you next time.